Greetings to you, you, and you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be tuning in from. We ask you to give us just a few moments to get the remaining of our social media streams going, and we will get right into our lesson tonight. God bless you. Go ahead while you're waiting and tag somebody. Share with somebody, call somebody, let them know that the Bible study where we encourage critical thinking is indeed on the air and that they don't want to miss it. Now, give me just a couple of minutes. This is the Rev. We're almost there. We're almost there. Give us just a moment. All right. Again, greetings, greetings, greetings. We want to thank you for tuning in again on this Monday uh, for another edition of a Bible study where we encourage critical thinking. We are in the Bible study series, Christianity, a Highjacked Religion. We are now looking at Max Weber and how he made a contribution to the Christian religion and how that plays into what you and I believe in today. Let us start out with prayer, my friends. Father, we bless you, we praise you, and we thank you. We ask your blessings and favor on everyone who are receiving this message right now live or may watch it at a later time. We ask now that you open our spiritual eyes, that we would see in the spiritual realm, our spiritual ears, that we might hear what you're saying to us individually as well as collectively as a church body. Now, God, as I lean not to my own understanding, but acknowledge you in all of my ways, I pray that you would direct my path, in so much that you allow the words of my mouth, the meditation of my heart to be acceptable in thy sight. You are indeed my strength and my redeemer. In the name of Ben Yahweh, Yeshua, Jesus Christ, we pray and we thank you. Amen and amen. Well, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, enemies and friends, it's that time for the disclaimer. If you're not willing to read for yourself, research for yourself, reason for yourself, process the information you're going to receive today for yourself, and ultimately take responsibility for your own spiritual growth, this may not be the Bible study for you. However, my friends, if indeed you are willing to read for yourself, research for yourself, reason for yourself, process the information you're going to receive today for yourself, and you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that your spiritual growth is your responsibility, stick around. You might not only learn something, you may enjoy this Bible study. Before we get into it, I've been on Clubhouse. Those of you who don't know what Clubhouse is, it is a new social media platform that is in the beta testing process right now. It's a platform to where you communicate through your iPhone. iPhones only, and iPads, the iOS system. And you go in and you go into a room, and we communicate through stages and audience, and it's auditory. It's all done by voice. And so therefore you have a profile that may have a picture on it, but other than that, the interaction is indeed live human interaction by the way of your phone. There is so much that's going on. I believe it's going to be greater and bigger and more important than Facebook, because it is indeed bringing in real human interaction on a social media platform. So enough for Clubhouse. If you want to know more about that, you can send me a message and we'll talk about that there. But we've met some beautiful, beautiful people on Clubhouse and made some starting of some great relationships. And a young lady that I met, a fellow veteran, on a room that I host on Clubhouse on Sundays at 3 o'clock. It's Strong Love, talks about PTSD. And I met a young lady in there on yesterday, and we had a wonderful conversation today, and she shared with me something that I'm going to continue to share now on Mondays as well as on Sundays. And so if you want to support your veterans, you don't have to be a veteran to do this, but to support your veterans, there is a initiative, a project where they're putting a book together. There's like 12 different areas of that book that you can go in and make a comment and contribute, and these will go out to veterans. So you can find that at www.nevcc.org/projects. That's again, www.nevcc.org/projects. And I've already made my contribution, and I encourage each of you to make yours and to also invite others to do so, because all of our veterans need to be encouraged. And so you never know what word that you say or act of kindness that you extend may prevent a veteran from committing suicide or be the very thing that they need to make it through that day. All right. So with that being said, very briefly, we're in part 4 of this particular part of our series, and we have gone over this pyramid or hierarchy of looking at the monarchy, and so there was the monarch, the tenants in chief, the subtenants, and then the sub tenants, the peasantry. And so I'm not going to completely go over this. The only thing I want to say right here, because we've already looked at it, and you can indeed pull it up on one of our previous Bible studies, is that notice how everything feeds into the top. Notice how everything feeds into the top. Notice at the very top is the monarch. That would be the king or the queen who's sitting on the throne. All right. This is actually, there's a African concept that was modeled also in Europe. We mostly hear about it from Europe, but this concept of monarchy actually began in the cradle of civilization, which is in Africa. Our point of interest focuses on the second tier, where you notice that right up under the monarch is that of the clergy. That's of the clergy and then of the knights. And so we're looking at, as we talk about Christianity, a hijacked religion, we're going back and looking at its origins all the way from Africa, all the way up to today in whatever denomination you, ma'am, or you, sir, may be associated with. And so right here, the second tier, under the old system of monarchy, we see the influence of the church. Oftentimes, this person who was at that position was the bishop, or the Pope, as it has evolved, and then you would have clergy on the third row as well. And so that's all I'm going to say about that for now. You can go back and, if you want more detail, and look at a previous Bible study. And then we went into this thing that America is built on called capitalism, which we introduced basically 2 Bible studies ago, and we went into it a little more in depth on the Bible study last week. And where capitalism, it says from the top, we rule you, we fool you, we shoot you, we eat for you, and then we work for all and feed all. And so again, we can look at this making of what we may know as the class system. And once again, we look at the very top there, we see what young people may call today the bag. That's money. Then we see the next is those who rule. All right. And at those who rule, then we find that then we have also on that level that we have the clergy, and then we also have clergy on the next level. So again, the church plays a vital role in these mechanisms that our country is built on, as well as those that Europe was built on. And again, look at the pyramid, look at how it goes, and look at the positions that the church plays there at the second row as well as the third row, if we don't count the very top under the capitalism, which is headed not by a person, but an idea or ideology, and that is of getting the bag or getting money. So one of the things we find is that about mindset, but I want to stop right here for a moment before I get into my dialogue about mindset, and I want to play again a portion of a video that we are using that is on YouTube. So give me a moment to change to that, and then we will watch that, and then we will come back and have our discussion. We encourage you, ma'am, we encourage you, sir, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, enemy and friends, to put comments in, put your questions in the comments, make your comments in the comments, but we need you and encourage you to interact with us. It helps us with the algorithms, both on YouTube as well as on Facebook. And so right now, if you're hearing me, I want you to go ahead and just put comment yes. If you are hearing me, okay. If you're joining in with us, and whether you have anything else to say right now, if you're listening, please, ma'am, please, sir, comment yes in the comments so that we know that you are there.
incredible advances in health and medicine. Maybe you think back to Marx or Durkheim and say that it was the shift from feudalism to capitalism. These are all good answers, but Max Weber had a different one. The most important change wasn't technical or economic or political. The biggest change, he said, the one that best distinguishes the modern world from the traditional one, was a difference in the way we think. Like most of the theorists we've studied so far, Max Weber lived at the end of the 19th century, and the turbulent changes of that time influenced him as it did all the others. He lived during the formation of the first German national state, and watching this process firsthand made him concerned with understanding modern society. So in his work, Weber examined some of the defining characteristics of the modern world, which sociologists have now spent over 100 years studying and arguing about. He focused on ideas like rationalization, bureaucracy, and social stratification, and when he saw where modernity was heading, he was really worried. But to understand what he was so worried about, you need to understand how we got to modernity in the first place. And for Weber, the real defining features of the transition from traditionalism and modernity were ways of thinking, not modes of production or social integration, but ideas. To think traditionally is to take the basic setup of the world as given. In other words, traditionalism sees the world as having a basic order, and that order is the way things ought to be. We can see this very clearly in feudalism and divine right monarchies. The monarch is understood as having been anointed by God, and you owe them your allegiance regardless of whether they're good or bad at their job. The question of whether or not they deserve the position never even comes up. But if traditionalism takes things for granted, modernity doesn't. In modernity, everything is up for grabs. What Weber saw when he looked at history was that societies and people were becoming more rational. They were undergoing a process of rationalization. And Weber's definition of rationality included three specific things: calculability, methodical behavior, and reflexivity. Calculability means that if we know the inputs, we can know the outputs. Just think of a bowl made in a factory versus one you make yourself. Every single bowl comes out of the factory exactly the same, whereas no two bowls you make by hand are going to quite match. Now, the reason that we know the outputs if we know the inputs is because there's methodical behavior involved, a procedure to follow. In the factory, the method is in the machines. So the results are going to be the same no matter who's pulling the levers. Finally, thinking rationally for Weber meant thinking about what you're doing. In other words, thinking reflexively. You're constantly looking for new ways to improve the process, for new and better and more efficient ways to make bowls. So traditional society is the society of individual artisans, each with their own process, which is how it's always been done. But modern society is the society of explicit instructions and standardized methodical procedures, which are always being reflected on and improved. So what caused this massive shift in how people think? What kicked off this process of rationalization? Weber gave here what might seem like an unlikely answer: religion. In his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber argued that the transition from traditionalism to modernity began with the Protestant Reformation. For hundreds of years, the Catholic Church dominated medieval Europe until, in 1517, a German priest named Martin Luther denounced corruption in the church. This set off a series of new religious movements that radically opposed Catholic dogma. This was the Protestant Reformation, and it's in these new movements that Weber saw the origin of modern rationality. Catholicism, after all, was the basis for the traditional worldview. Everything in medieval life, from the structure of the social order to the way you farm, was the way it was because God willed it. By contrast, in Lutheranism, you still have a divinely sanctioned place in the world, but for the first time, the question of how well you are performing your role became important.
I want to pause there for a moment, and we'll pick back up, but I want to emphasize and make sure that we heard what Weber believed was the cause for this shift in the world, which is mindset. And where was that mindset shaped? It was shaped out of the church. All right. It was shaped out of the church through religion. And so this is how we're connecting this thought of socialism from Mark Weber as it pertained to capitalism, and how that has its origin in the church under the auspices of religion. And so the mindset that shifted, again, came out of religion. So we're going to pick back up from there. And I know she talks fast, but we're going to discuss it a little bit more. I just want you to see the main points. And again, you can see that this can be found on YouTube. If you did a search under what you see there at the heading, Max Weber and Modernity, Crash Course Sociology, number 9, you can pull up this in your own leisure.
idea of personal responsibility opened the way for another important figure in Weber's view of history, John Calvin. Calvin didn't believe that God could possibly be concerned with anything that one measly little human might do. Instead, Calvin believed in predestination, the idea that your fate, whether you're saved or damned, has already been set by God from the beginning of the universe, and there's nothing you can do to change it. You're either one of the elect or you're not. So how do you know? Through what Calvinists called a proof of election. And here's where personal responsibility really comes in. The proof that you were saved was to be found in how you lived your life. So the point of your life was no longer that it was divinely appointed. It became a matter of how well or how much you work. And by extension of this logic, success itself became proof of election. If you're financially successful, then that was a sign that you were blessed by God. Suddenly, you didn't just work until your needs were met as you did in traditional society.
All right. Is a need for me to stop right here, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, enemies and friends. I don't want anybody just to skim over this point that has been made as we think about the prosperity ministry. Many may think it started in Azusa Street out in California, but I want you to understand that it did not start there. As a matter of fact, it didn't even start right here in our lesson under Calvinism. It actually started back in the Bible. It started with Abraham, and Abraham, of course, was not a Jew, although Abraham is the father of the Israelites and the African Hebrew Israelites, because Jacob had not been born yet, and indeed it is Jacob whose name was changed to Israel, who became the father of the African Hebrew Israelites. But this concept of God's blessing, this concept of prosperity on God's people began in the Bible. As we look back again, all the way back to Abraham, it was believed by the culture that those who God gave favor to those who God actually blessed, would show up in the prosperity or in their riches of what they owned. That concept continued on with Job. Many of you may know the story of Job. His friends accused him of having committed sin. He actually called himself putting God on trial to ask God what was it that he had done in order for him to experience what he was going through. And it's because of the mindset. Let me say that again. It was because of the mindset that those who experienced prosperity financially, through their cattle, through the amount of children that they had, and their wealth, were being blessed by God, and those who did not were being cursed by God. And so in Job's case, it would have been that he was enjoying the prosperity of God while he was obedient, but he must have, in the minds of his friends, done something wrong. And that's why Job insisted that he had not done anything wrong, but it was the mindset. That continued on all the way up until we get to Deuteronomy chapter 28. Many people are familiar with Deuteronomy 28 verses 1 through 14 that talks about the blessings, but oftentimes they skip out the largest portion of that chapter, which are verses 15 through 68, I believe it is, that talks about the curses if the African Hebrew Israelites are not indeed obedient. In hindsight, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we can look and determine that they were disobedient. Therefore, because of the causal statement, because of the condition that God gave, that they did not receive verses 1 through 14, which was what would happen if they were obedient, but indeed they followed the conditions and the consequences of being disobedient, which had twice as many curses as there was blessings. And therefore, it was at that point that I would submit to you that the concept of prosperity being a result of the favor of God began to fade, because indeed both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom were conquered, one by the Assyrians and then the other by the Babylonians. This was indeed a following up or the actions that God had already said would take place for them being disobedient. It's now in Europe under this transformation from feudalism to capitalism under the church, that now this idea is brought back into light. And this idea is brought back to light after the protest of the Catholic Church, which at that point, the prosperity was for the pulpit, but not for the pew. Prosperity for the pulpit and poorness for, or poverty for the pew. This is challenged under the Reformation that was began not by Martin Luther, but we've already discussed that it started all the way back hundreds of years prior to him, not particularly with a gentleman named John Wycliffe, but John Wycliffe was accredited. And we have history because there were many who were unsung heroes whose names have never been mentioned that were a part of the movement. But it was under this movement of the protest that Calvin was able to introduce this idea that I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, enemies and friends, is indeed the genesis of the prosperity ministry as we understand it in these Americas today. And that is that if God's blessing is on you, that it is identified by the riches that you accumulate. And that if indeed that you don't have it, then you're not living up to your God-given potential if you are a child of God. This is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years prior to the Azusa Street experience. And we just want to, again, as we encourage critical thinking in our Bible studies, to take us back to the actual origin, and then we're going to bring it up to date. With that being said, let's go ahead and hear a little more of this crash course lesson.
Now, the work was an end in itself, and you worked to accumulate as much wealth as possible because wealth proved you were saved. This is the sociological consequence of the Protestant Reformation that Weber studied and understood. It transformed a communal, traditional society into an individualistic, capitalist society.
I'm sorry. I got to stop again. Oh, Lord have mercy. Help us. What did she say? She said that your prosperity or your wealth proved that you were saved. That's not what Ben Yahweh Yeshua Jesus the Christ said, but this became the mindset of the church. This became the mindset of the church. This, of course, is in Europe. This mindset then is brought to the Americas by the Europeans that came and settled and said that they found something that was already here. And so we need to understand that this comes out of, if you indeed identify yourself as a Christian or a follower of the way, this is a part of your history, ma'am. This is a part of your history served. Now, notice what she said to slide this up now. It transformed a communal, traditional society. That's what the African Hebrew Israelites were. All right. She's speaking now of it in Europe. I already told you before that it came out of Africa. They were modeling something that had already taken place in Africa, had taken place in Egypt and various other countries within the continent of Africa. The African Hebrew Israelites were indeed a communal and a traditional society. But what happens now as this new mindset is brought into fruition, what happens now under this reformation of the Catholic Church, of Christianity, as we were introduced into the protest, which now we know as Protestants or Protestantism, is that we shifted from a communal, traditional society to an individualistic, capitalist society. An individualistic, capitalist society. And where does this take place at? This starts with the church, ladies and gentlemen. All right, let's get some more. Let's get some more.
Was was focused on economic success. And I don't know if you've noticed, but modern capitalism is nothing if not rational. Think about it. You must work methodically in your calling. You must be constantly reflecting on your work in order to work more efficiently and productively. And you use profit as a calculable measure of your success. So rationalization gets its start in religion around questions of how we work. But Weber spent his career showing how all of society came to be organized rationally. In fact, if you've ever been to the DMV, you've seen what Weber argued was one of the biggest impacts of rationalization in society: the rise of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is a key part of the transition from the traditional to the modern state, and Weber identified 6 traits that make it both extremely rational and very efficient. It's composed of a hierarchy of positions with an extremely clear chain of command. This hierarchy is made up of many very specialized roles and is held together by formal written communications. The people in the bureaucracy accomplish their work with technical competence according to detailed rules and regulations, and they do it without regard to the particular people they're serving. In other words, they do it impersonally. And I can't think of a better example of all these traits than the bureaucracy you see at the DMV. The workers do their jobs competently and according to the rules, and they treat you just like they would treat anyone else without regard for your personal characteristics. That is, impersonally. But there isn't only this change in the way the state works. There's also a change in the way the state is obeyed. In a traditional society, Weber believed that the state ruled through traditional legitimacy. People followed the king because that's how it had always been done. But the modern state works differently. It rules through a combination of what we call legal rational and charismatic legitimacy. Legal rational legitimacy is essentially a belief in the system itself. You follow...
All right, I got to pause, because perhaps you've never heard or considered that this word that is often used in the prosperity ministry or the propagation of it, this word charismatic. So where do we see it at? Of course, there was charisma in the African churches, but here it is as it relates to Christianity as we know it today, that this word charismatic is being brought up in the content of capitalism that was presented again by the church under Calvinism, all right, under Calvinism. So again, it began at Azusa Street. Azusa Street had its place and time. However, there was a movement that was in place hundreds of years prior to Azusa Street that we can trace back to being the origin of the movement that still exists today, all right? And so let's continue on.
The rules because they are the rules. So the DMV employee doesn't ask for a certain piece of paperwork because that's how it's always been done. He does it because that's how the procedure instructs him to do it. If the manual were rewritten tomorrow, he'd do it that way instead. But there's a problem with legal rational legitimacy and with bureaucracy in general. If it's all about following the rules, well, somebody needs to make the rules. That's where charismatic legitimacy comes in. You follow the commands of a charismatic leader because of the extraordinary characteristics of that person. So the modern state is an apparatus of rules which are ultimately directed by a group of charismatic leaders. In the US, for instance, when we go to the polls every 4 years, we're making a choice about who's going to direct the bureaucracy. And we make that choice based on the characteristics of the people running. And here's another one of Weber's major contributions to sociology: the idea that the people who run to be leaders of our bureaucracies do so with the support of political parties. For Weber, political parties were a key example of social stratification, or the way that people in society are divided according to the power they hold. Weber didn't think that society was divided purely based on economic classes or your relationship to the means of production, like Marx did. He argued that the system was more complicated and consisted of 3 elements. Like Marx, he included class, but he didn't think that classes had unifying interests. Weber also included political parties, defined broadly as groups that seek social power. And finally, he included status groups, defined by social honor, which includes things like respect and prestige. All 3 of these things, class, power, and status, affected a person's place in society. More importantly, each of these elements of social stratification could vary independently. So there's...
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I want to bring up something to you. If we look at this with an honest eye, if we process this through the filter of truth, do we not see this social, and I'm going to pull it back, the slide back, do we not see this system within the church? Do we not see this system in the church of this social stratification? And I'm trying to get it back to the slide.
Finally, he included status groups defined by...
All right, so do we not have a class system? Do we not have indeed our own mini set of political parties within the church? And do we not have status groups? There are certain people that can get to the pastor at almost any time, and there are others that have to go through the system in order to get to the pastor or to the first lady. And so these constructs, these systems are systems that were created again in Europe and a part of the Reformation. And so if we identify them, oftentimes we talk about them, especially if we are at the bottom of that class system that's within the church. And sometimes it doesn't matter what our social economic status is. That can be changed within the confines of the church system, which actually right now is being highly challenged because of COVID-19 and the inability for us to be able to meet together. While some churches are still holding open church, they still have to do it with limitations. And so again, just a point of clarification and a point that I want you to be able to look at where this actually started from so that we can understand it better, so then that we can do better because we understand where it came from and ultimately realize when we pray, how to pray. Because some may be wondering, why are you even bringing all this up? What does it matter? Some think that all we have to do is confess with our mouth, believe in our heart the Lord Jesus, that God raised him from the dead, and we shall be saved. And brothers and sisters, that is the initial step that we make. But my question to you is this: what after you are saved? That's why we're doing this type of Bible study, because you've got to answer that. What after? Are you going to continue every day to just do the same thing and relive the experience of your initial salvation? Does a person who is drowning go back in the water just so that whoever it was that saved them can keep saving them over and over again? I think not, my brothers and sisters. And so more importantly of the life that you live, when Ben Yahweh Yeshua, Jesus the Christ, declared that we ought to let our light shine, we've got to have some energy behind that light in order for it to shine. And where do we get that energy? This is a part of where you get that energy at, brothers and sisters. Understanding your history, understanding how you got to where you are, understanding what is expected, whether it's a reasonable expectation of not, and understanding what the objections are so that you can overcome those objections so that you can get to the purpose, which is for you to be a beacon of light that is so strong and has so much power that the frequencies that you radiate overpower the frequencies of darkness by bringing in the light, not your own light, but the light of Jesus. Did I just say all of that? I think I'm getting a little bit excited. Let's go ahead and listen to a little bit more.
Social honor, which includes things like respect and prestige. All three of these things, class, power, and status, affected a person's place in society. More importantly, each of these elements of social stratification could vary independently. So there could be a poor priest, say, who is high in social prestige but of a low class, or a lottery winner who is of a high class but low in status, or a bureaucrat in a political party who has some measure of political power but not necessarily money or status. And then there are those who can turn their fame or status into political power. Unlike Marx, Weber didn't take a particularly critical stand on stratification in society, but that doesn't mean he didn't see its problems. For Weber, rationalization was the defining feature of the modern age, and he was deeply worried about it. Remember, rationalization is about three things: calculability, methodical behavior, and reflexivity. But it's really easy to lose reflexivity, to stop reflecting on your work or your role, and instead become locked in a calculated routine that becomes meaningless and unthinking. Weber worried that the systems that rationalization built will leave behind the ideas that built them, and that they'll simply roll on forever, meaninglessly under their own momentum. He worried that we'll become locked in what he called an iron cage of bureaucratic capitalism from which we can't escape. Our lives will become nothing but a series of interactions based on rationalized rules with no personal meaning behind them. This worry about meaning and the concern for ideas and how they shape our reality is one of the big influences that Weber handed down to future sociologists. On the micro level, these ideas were picked up by what's known as the symbolic interactionist paradigm and theorists like Irving Goffman. Meanwhile, theorists like Talia Parsons and
all right, we're going to pause there for now and actually go and look at the slides that I have set up for tonight. We're not ready to get to this part of the video yet, so give me a moment to transition back to our slides. And while I'm doing that, if you are able to hear everything from the video, okay, type yes if you're able to hear the audio from the video, okay, so I know if I need to adjust it on next week or not. And let me see, what do we see? I'm glad to see Angelo and Miss Kate, Miss Francine and Miss Carolyn, and thank you, Brenda, my friend that we just met last week, and it seems like we've known each other all our lives, and so I want to thank you for joining in, and we did share the website and invite everyone to go and contribute to the book that is going to go out to our veterans. And so, again, as we look at mindset, mindset is so very important. It is responsible for more than we think. And we know that for some, we've talked about this before, but we want to remind you again, we want to reestablish it, that mindset is so very important, and mindset is established by our environment. Mindset is established by how we are wired when we're still in our mother's womb. Mindset is established by the status quo that is around us. Mindset is established by how we are educated. And so it should be a ever evolving thing, but we need to look at what causes us to think the way that we do. Again, we want to remind you that the Catholic Church dominated medieval Europe from the time of Constantine until the early 1500s. From the time of Constantine to the early 1500s, the Emperor Constantine sort of dictated what the correct and acceptable mindset was. Now, we know that there are those who disagree with the mindset, and so they would have been considered to be rebels, all right? Because it was indeed the belief then that the monarch was in the position that he or she was in at the will of God, and therefore whatever they propagated, whatever they taught was acceptable unto God, so it needed to be accepted by the people. That began to be changed in the 1500s, and we know that that's during the time frame of the Reformation. Again, this is a review at Mark Weber, when, again, we're doing this Bible study on Christianity, a hijacked religion, and specifically now we're looking at the American prosperity gospel as it relates to the Bible. And now we look at the shift from feudalism to capitalism, which again, to my surprise, to be honest with you, to my surprise, and I've been studying history of Christianity for a long time, to really embrace that this machine that we call capitalism was indeed started out of the Christian church. Feudalism, or a feudal system, was a dominant social system created in the medieval Europe consisting of the class system, which we already showed that at the beginning of this Bible study. We looked at the monarchy. And as I just said, the people believe that the monarch was indeed blessed and put in position by God. This word, I'm going to skip the nobility, the vassals, and the peasants. We already talked about that in the last weeks, and you can see it on the slide. And it's just basically just the class system or the tiers under the monarch. We also see that class system in our current day society, just in a different way. Bureaucracy, a system of government in which most of the important decisions are made by state officials rather than the elected representatives. And so we can still see the bureaucracy or the machine of bureaucracy in our very current system here in the United States of America. We should recognize the fact that because we live in a capitalistic society, which is based off of economics, that economics affords a politician then to propagate their position, as well as to get responses within the system that determines what's right and what is wrong, determines what legislation goes through and actually becomes bills. This is a part of the bureaucracy, all right? And so we must understand that from a natural perspective, but also recognize that within the church has its own subsets of bureaucracy. Again, those who determine what will happen, what things get actually passed, what is acceptable and what's not acceptable, who remains a part of the community and who is excommunicated from the community. These are all things that happen within our church society, within our church community, that are not often addressed. Oftentimes you'll hear a pastor or pastors say something to the effect of, if you don't like what happens here, there's the door. There are other churches that you can be a part of. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a part of the bureaucracy. And again, I would suggest, I highly recommend that if you want a better understanding of what it should be, is that you read Matthew chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7 to see what indeed it was that Ben Yahweh Yeshua, Jesus the Christ, said. Look at the culture in which he operated in. Look at how he dealt with the bureaucracy of the time. Look at how he became inclusive and rather than exclusive. He didn't excommunicate people out of the church, but he indeed brought people into the church. He didn't embarrass anybody. Don't let me get started, but go back and look at how Ben Yahweh Yeshua, Jesus Christ, dealt with the bureaucracy, and then you can compare or use that as a filter for wherever you at. I'm not talking about your pastor. I'm not talking about your overseer. I'm not talking about your bishop. I'm not talking about your apostle. What I am talking about is that if you reason for yourself, if you process information for yourself, if you can read for yourself, read what Jesus said and compare that to whoever, even me. If I'm off base, please come back and let me know. Again, we encourage critical thinking, and so you can put it right there in the comments. You can send me a message, or you can put it live in the comments and we will address it. But this is our history, and so the bureaucracy we have as a Christian, we deal with two different communities of bureaucracy, that of our social world and that of our Christian world or societies. Social stratification, which is what this particular lesson started out with, refers to social categorization of its people in rankings of social economic tiers based on factors like wealth, income, race, education, and power. And you knew that, whether you knew that or not. You have been a part of that system, whether you recognize or admit that you are part of that system. Each one of us fits somewhere in those tiers. Then traditionalism. Can I tell you, Sister Newsom, can I tell you, Sister Francine, can I tell you, Miss Kate, that our churches suffer from this thing called traditionalism? It was good enough for my granddaddy. It was good enough for my grandmother. So it's good enough for me. But we stop at whoever that grandmother, grandmama. Let's go back again to what was it that Jesus did? What did Ben Yahweh do? What is the definition of traditionalism? It's the idea that the world has a basic order. There's a basic order, and that order is accepted as the way things are supposed to be. This happens all the way from our politicians, from our presidents, or from our monarchs, all the way down to even how we treat animals, dogs, cats, and birds, or whatever that we may have as a pet. It fits under this category of traditionalism, and how this basic order that has been pre-established is accepted as the way things are supposed to happen. One of the things that folks must say is, like, you may go to a church that for communion, it has to be on the first Sunday, and the ushers had better not touch the communion plate without having gloves on. Well, did Jesus say anything about that? Did Jesus say anything about having gloves? Did he say anything about a communion table or a communion plate? But because of tradition, this is accepted as the way it has always been, and so it's the way that it always should be. Modernity, rationalization. This is a part of what we're introducing when we say this is a Bible study where we encourage critical thinking. We don't want you just to accept it because we said it. We want you to process it with that dynamic computer that God put in your head called a brain. We want you to use it and rationalize the information that you are receiving so that you can process it in the proper way. All right. She talked about causability, wherein that we know if we know what the input in is, then we can determine what the output is. She talked about methodical behavior. In other words, that's what happens on the assembly line, is that they've come up with a methodical method in order to create or build whatever it is that they build, and it's repeated over and over and over again because it works. It kind of may fit into that cliche that says, if it's not broke, don't fix it. All right. And not that I agree with that, although there was a point that I did. If it's not broke, don't fix it. Well, what if it's not broke, but it can be improved? And so it goes on. She talks about reflexivity, thinking about what you are doing. In other words, to reflect on why you said what you said. Reflect on why you wear the gloves at the communion. Reflect on why you believe the way that you believe. Can I submit to you, brothers and sisters, that there are a lot of Christians that do not know why they are Christian other than they grew up in the church? Can I submit to you that many don't know the history of the Christian or the movement that they are part of? Many have no idea that Ben Yahweh, Yeshua, Jesus of Christ did indeed start a reformation or start a revolution from what was traditionally taught, the traditions that he grew up with, the thinking that he grew up with, and the mindset of the people, that he stepped away from that. If you don't believe me, again, read Matthew chapter 5. All right, so the question that is important to us is, what shifted the mindset from traditionalism to modernity? And we've already addressed that according to Weber, and I happen to agree as I've looked at the history, and I'd be interested in what you think, ma'am or sir. So you can, if you have a thought, put it in the comments, and if you want to do some research and come back, put in what you find in the comments. But indeed, Weber said it was religion. Boy, I tell you, religion is responsible for so much, responsible for more deaths in wars, more separations than marriages and infidelity. Religion is at the head of the list of things that can negatively affect a human being, whether you want to accept it or not. Religion is at the very top of the list of what has caused all of the dissension and the division, to include death. Was that the way that Ben Yahweh intended it to be? I would submit no. The Reformation And again, this is a recap for those who may be joining us for the first time. We look at the 1300s to the 1400s, that name I mentioned earlier of John Wycliffe, who you can actually, there's a Bible called the John Wycliffe Bible. He began to translate the Latin Bible into English so that the pew would have access to the same material that the pulpit had access to. He also denounced the corruption that was going on in the religious machine called the Catholic Church at the time. Then 1517, which was referenced in the video that we watched, was Martin Luther, who denounced the corruption also in the Catholic Church, riding on the back of John Wycliffe and those unsung heroes whose names have never been mentioned. It was Martin Luther then who nailed his 95 Theses on the church door that the church ignored, which then was what ignited what we know as the Reformation or the protest that created a subculture within Christianity, which became known as the Protestants. And that's what many of us are a part of, that movement called Protestants, which came out of this protest of the corruption of the Catholic Church. Lutheranism. I'm going to read what we have on the slides, and if you have a question, ma'am or sir, ladies and gentlemen, boys or girls, please put in the comments. And if you are still hearing me, okay, please go ahead and put yes in the comments so I know that you're still here. If you hear me, okay, put yes in the comments because I haven't seen any comments in a few. So please put yes in the comments if you are still with me and you can still hear me, okay. So Lutheranism, actually, as the name describes, comes from the concepts and the teaching of Martin Luther. Comes from the concepts taught by Martin Luther, or we can say the doctrine of Martin Luther. Thank you, Ms. Francine. She put yes in. Thank you, and I'm looking for others to make sure you put yes in to know that we're hearing you. So again, as it indicates, Lutheranism comes from the doctrine and the teaching of Martin Luther. It's one of the largest branches of Protestantism that identifies with the teachings of Martin Luther, what I just said, a 16th century German reformer, German, not African, reformer whose efforts to reform the theology and practices of the church launched the Protestant Reformation. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, enemies and friends, the operative words there are the theology and practices of the church, our theology and the practices which help shape the mindset of those to come. Where did it come from? It came from Lutheranism. It came from what was propagated by Martin Luther. Listen what it says. The reaction of the government and the church authorities to this international spread of his writings, beginning with the 95 Theses, divided Western Christianity. All right. So Western Christianity was divided here in the 15 and the 1600s by this shift in a mindset that came to the forefront with Martin Luther's 95 Theses. But as we have already indicated, it did not start with Martin Luther. There were others like John Wycliffe, and again, those whose names have not been recorded that we don't know of, that begin to protest against the mindset and the power of the Catholic Church. Catholic Church, which had hijacked Christianity from what it was when Yahweh, Yeshua, Jesus the Christ revolutionized Judaism to that group called Followers of the Way, who then became known as Christians, and then that was hijacked by the Catholic Church, which continues to be in operation today. It says his 95 Theses divided Western Christianity. During the Reformation, Lutheranism became the state religion of numerous states of Northern Europe. Again, where? Northern Europe. When you hear me use the term Eurocentric theology, this is what I'm referring to. The states of Northern Europe, especially in Northern Germany and the Nordic countries. Lutheran clergy became civil servants, and the Lutheran churches became part of that state. And so we see a movement. We can hear in the 95 Theses the disdain of these particular individuals in the church, and this became a movement that changed the world. It divided Christianity, which has continued to be divided in subsets even unto today, my brothers and my sisters. The Protestant Reformation, again, she mentioned Calvinism. Calvinism coming from John Calvin, and this is where we are introduced with this idea of capitalism, this idea of prosperity being a sign of your salvation. Let me say that one more time, that prosperity being a sign of your salvation began under what's known as Calvinism. Now, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, enemies and friends, I don't want you to become a theologian. I just want you to understand the origin of the religion that you practice. I want you to understand the history of it. I want you to understand where certain principles that are maybe in the doctrine of your church, or certain principles that may be covered in your covenant, that certain principles that may be covered in your articles of faith. I want you to understand where they came from and to recognize the fact that if you want to know if they line up with Ben Yahweh, Yeshua, Jesus the Christ, take them and filter them again through Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And so here under Calvinism, the Protestant theological system of John Calvin and his successors, which developed Lutherans' doctrine of justification by faith. Have you heard that before? If you've heard that before, please, please, please put in yes in the comments. If you've heard that before, justification by faith. Some say justification by faith alone. If you've heard that concept, if you're familiar with that concept, put yes in the comments. Where did it come from? It came out of, according to these teachings, it came out of Lutheranism and his interpretation of the Bible at the time that he nailed the 95 Theses on the church door. It was further propagated by Calvin, all right? Further propagated or taught by Calvin. So the doctrine of justification by faith alone, and emphasizes the grace of God and the doctrine of predestination. In other words, that doctrine of predestination, which also Calvin agreed with, was that when we are born, that we are either predetermined to be in the group that's going to go to heaven, or predetermined to be in the group that's going to go to hell. Now, this is expressed in many different ways in different churches under different denominations. Some keep it exactly as I've stated it, and some will expand on it. All right, but the principle of it and the bottom line came that this ideology, this mindset, came from this teaching of Luther and this teaching of Calvin. All right, saved by faith and faith alone, we can find in the Gospels. Not the Gospels, we can find in the writings of the New Testament under the epistles, where the argument is, are we saved by, I believe James talks about it, are we saved by faith or are we saved by our works? All right, now to fully understand that, brothers and sisters, and when we go back and look at the origin of capitalism and look at the origin of the doctrine as it goes back to the Reformation, then there almost would appear to be a contradiction, because indeed Calvinism said that we could determine salvation based off of the prosperity. What was the prosperity? Prosperity had to do with how hard you worked and how hard you were rewarded by that work. So that would then give the appearance or the inference that part of your salvation was a part dependent on how well that you worked. Okay, where the argument presented by James was that how well you worked had nothing to do with it. Some have extended that to say that you're not saved by works, but you will work because you're saved. Let me say that one more time. It says that you're not saved by your works, but you will work because you're saved. If you agree with me, put in there, I agree, I agree in the comments if you agree that we're not saved by our works, but because of our salvation that we will work. You don't get saved and then do nothing. You don't get saved and sit down and hide your light. You don't get saved and then disconnect from the power that saved you, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. So if you agree with that, go ahead and put I agree in the comments. And it looks like I'm coming up to my hour of teaching. So if you give me 5 minutes, then we're going to close this session out and we will pick back up on next week. Time just seems to move along when you're having fun. I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, enemies, and even my friends, but I'm having a time here sharing with you the truth about this thing we call religion, especially this machine that we call Christianity. Well, actually, that's it. So we're going to close out. I don't have any more slides. If you have any questions, we've already asked that you will put them into the comments. I'm going to go back to this side. Please support our veterans. Please support our veterans, ma'am, sir. Take a moment to go to www.nevcc.org/projects and leave your input in this book that's being compiled for veterans to let them know that you appreciate them, whether you are a veteran or not. And especially if you are a veteran, we believe in veterans helping veterans. So please, ma'am, please, sir, go ahead. And again, there are 12 different areas once you get to the site that you can choose from of where you want to make your contribution. And I want to say thank you so very much to my sister, Brenda Warren, who brought this to my attention on today. And as I said, prior to coming on tonight live, I went and I made my contribution. And so you'll begin seeing this now on Monday nights as well as on our Sundays until the book is actually published, because I believe in supporting those initiatives that support our veterans, being a retired veteran myself. So we love you. God bless you. And until next time, remember to stay safe. Remember that COVID is still on the rise. As I left the house, I saw on the news that America has reached over 500,000 deaths due to COVID. So be vigilant. Stay safe, mask up, use your hand sanitizer, wash your hands, keep your social distancing until we get to the other side of through. This has been another Bible study where our series is Christianity, a Highjacked Religion. We're looking at capitalism under Max Weber, and we encourage critical thinking. God bless you. I love you. And until next time, you can't change that.